Jay O'Connor,
Yeah.
46,
Yeah.
Blanchardstown, long time in the game.
Yeah.
Finally, he's looking at a pretty hefty sentence for this, although he has pleaded guilty before the Special Criminal Court to conspiring to murder a man who was shot 8 years ago. But has he been in and out of the jail system or very little? He seems to have been a constant presence in that area from way back when the Westies would have been about. And he's constantly feuding. I mean, this is he's into his fifth decade of life.
Yeah, I mean, Jay O'Connor has really been in. You can see the long-term impact of these feuds. It's really a feud that was sparked after the Westies collapse, the Westies drugs gang, that obviously you've written about many times. They took over the heroin trade.
Boring.
Well, it doesn't. You're not, Nicola. No. And you're not old either. But so they were obviously primarily a heroin and cocaine dealing gang that took over a large part of the northwest of Dublin in the 1990s. They eventually fled to Spain, the two leaders of the gang. And after they left and subsequently disappeared, there was a fallout from that large gang that they had amassed around them. Now, Jay O'Connor was even...
Sorry, would they have been this age?
They would have been
in their mid-40s had they lived.
Well, they would be probably in their early 50s, slightly older, weren't they? There was a age gap between Suggs and Coat. It's
just like the Westies are stuck in time, aren't they?
The Westies are
sort of young, crazy criminals, and of course, so many people have died, and they themselves were found under a sheet of concrete in Petral, I think, in Spain.
Exactly. I mean, it's so historical, even for us that remember back that well. I mean, I'm sure the name the Westies is still known on, people growing up in that area. But I mean, they're a feature of history. But the reality is, Jay O'Connor, 20 years later, or more than 20 years later, after the two leaders departed the scene, is still playing out a feud that sparked up as a result of the power vacuum they left behind. Jay O'Connor was very much a part of the Westies. He, like a lot of the criminals we speak about of that age, he followed the same sort of pattern. Started off as a sort of prolific joyrider, was involved in sort of robberies across the country where stolen cars would be taken to different parts of the countryside. Robberies would be done, and as the Westies grew into a drugs gang, he was right at the centre of that. Now, you remember when those two guys did go.
Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg, of course, we're talking about.
Exactly, and when they left, there was a feud broke out pretty much straight away. Involving different factions that had once been part of the same gang. They
kind of left because of the feud, did they not? I mean, from memory, what happened was the gang sort of imploded, which is such a usual thing. Of course, they were young upcoming criminals, were starting into the cocaine boom. They want to slice the action. In order to own their territory, they become ever more violent. They had such an incredible reputation for holding people over the towers in Ballymun by the ankles, swinging them off the side of those, burning people for drug debts of like €100. No one got away with anything. They personally slashed and sliced people up, beat people up, horrendously violent. The gang implodes and the Glennon brothers go.
But they go
take on one side, and then you have the remnants of Coates and Suggs gang. I think Shane Coates and Stephen Suggs went to Spain.
Yes, they were coming under pressure.
Bernard Sugg was
killed. Bernard Sugg was left. They had been under various pressures, both internal and I think external pressure as well from various people. And into the mix of all of that was a guy called Babyface Lindsay, who was very much an associate at that stage of George the Penguin Mitchell. And there was kind of a divide. But the Glennon brothers basically took on the rest of the Westies. Mark and Andrew. They were ultimately both shot dead.
Yeah.
Bernard Sugg, who kind of taken over that faction.
He was sort of minding things, I think, for Sugg and Coates when they went off to Spain, to Alicante.
Yeah. Now, Jay O'Connor sided with the Glennon brothers. He took that side. And on the other side were another two brothers called Daniel and David Goulding, and they took the other side, even though they'd all grown up. I think Jay O'Connor in particular had been very close to the Goulding brothers as they grew up. And from that moment until now, you're talking about, I think the Goulding brothers were shot dead in 2004, as far as I remember. So from then on...
That's a death toll of 6 there already that we've just...
Yeah.
I mean, there's more, but...
Yeah. And from then, there's been a number of shootings, other violent attacks associated with that fallout between childhood friends. And it's maybe gone under the radar to some extent, but Jay O'Connor has been at the forefront of that feud. We've seen probably the most notorious incident was when a guy called Keith Walker was shot dead in 2015. Keith Walker was a totally innocent man. He was involved in a pigeon club. Jay O'Connor, to this day, was very much an enthusiast for racing pigeons. Very heavily involved in it. Keith Walker was, knew Jay O'Connor through that world, through the pigeon world, but wasn't a criminal at all. He had met Jay O'Connor earlier the day he was shot, and then later on that day he was visiting this pigeon club, and he was ambushed by a guy dressed as a woman who shot him dead in a case of mistaken identity, thinking he was going to kill Jay O'Connor. A guy called Christopher McDonald now is serving life for that murder.
You're talking 2013 there.
Well, is it not 2015?
2015.
Yeah.
Because just to go back a little bit before we go on, 2012, is it? Are you talking about Babyface Lindsay, the same guy that disappears and is suspected to have been murdered by Eric Lucky Wilson?
Murdered by Eric Lucky Wilson on the orders of Michael Kelly, who paid Eric Lucky Wilson to kill him. So Babyface Lindsay was a kind of a very significant drug supplier in his day, and he had become involved with elements of the Westies. There had been people behind the scenes, I suppose, different suppliers who were supplying the Westies, and Lindsay had taken one side, and he was ultimately murdered. I mean, his body has never been found, but it was believed that Eric Lucky Wilson killed him and chopped his body up, and I think threw body parts into the ocean. So the feud rolled on.
And just do a quick timeline there.
Yeah.
So it's 2003.
Yeah.
Sugg and Coates go to Spain, Alicante, because this feud has broken out. Okay.
Yeah.
In that same year, Bernard Sugg, the younger brother of Stephen, is gunned down. That's in 2003. I think the two in Spain, Sugg and Coates, are found dead in 2004, or at least disappear then.
Yeah.
They've been buried under a warehouse. The word is from there that they had sort of tried to muscle in Spain and Alicante. They had sort of had a bit of a fallout with some of the wider Gilligan gang.
Yeah.
And they had been taught a very harsh lesson, to say the least. So they did disappear in 2004, but their bodies weren't found for 3 years. By 2005, Andrew and Mark Glennon are both killed. Okay. And it's 2008 when Babyface Lindsay disappears and is believed to be murdered and tortured in the north of Ireland by Eric Lucky Wilson. So now it continues. It continues.
And Jay O'Connor continues kind of at a high level of crime.
He's suspected of shooting Goulding 6 times in 2012.
2012.
He survives that.
Shooting David Goulding.
Yeah.
He survives that. In the meantime, Jay O'Connor also runs afoul of the real IRA. He is taken to a park in North Dublin by Alan Ryan, who's demanding protection money off him. And he is held down and his finger is sawn off with a hacksaw.
Right.
By Alan Ryan personally, as a couple of people hold him down. So,
right.
That's the, and Alan Ryan, of course, famously would talk about that to journalists, to show he was a real character. This is at the height of the Ryan gang. But the feud continues with David Goulding and with his brother Daniel Goulding. And certainly the associates of the Goulding brothers are suspected of hiring Christopher McDonald to kill Jay O'Connor in 2015. Obviously a killing that went really tragically wrong and saw an innocent man lose his life. At this point then, there's people coming in and out of the prison system all the time in the middle of all of this, which is just adds to the, I suppose, the chaotic nature of these things. Mm-hmm. So in 2021, Daniel Goulding gets out of prison. He's the brother of David. David has also served lengthy sentences, including for a kilo of cocaine. While he's in prison, he's being visited by Michael Kelly, and that association seems to grow. Daniel Goulding is his brother, also been involved in the Westies all the way through. And in 2021, he gets out, and the reports in the build-up to a very notorious incident that he become increasingly paranoid that Jay O'Connor was going to seek revenge for the earlier murder attempt, the botched murder attempt. And he starts to amass weapons in his home. And eventually he has this confrontation with Gardaí where two detectives receive non-fatal shots as they come to confront him. And Daniel Goulding would eventually plead guilty to the attempted murder of two Detective Gardaí. I mean, if you remember it, there was videos of it. It was really, really chaotic.
Yeah.
He seems to have been in a particularly, paranoid state at that point. So the thing, the feuding is ongoing all the way throughout all of this.
It's unbelievable that it can go on that long if you look at that timeline we've just discussed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Westies come to fruition in the late 90s, just as we sort of embark on the new century, 2000. Within 3 years, they're gone to Spain because this feud has broken out. Now, that's 24 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's still going on.
It's still going on. I mean, there's so many incidents we haven't even referred to, but there's an incident even where Jay O'Connor, right back at the start, is allegedly slashed by babyface Lindsay with a knife. I suppose the incident that we're seeing him being convicted of pleading guilty occurs in December 2016. After the murder of Keith Walker, Jay O'Connor is arrested by the police. There's an attempted murder of a guy called Charlie Cooper, who Jay O'Connor would have been one of his targets, let's put it that way.
He's seriously injured, but he doesn't die.
Yeah,
he was multiple times. Survives
multiple times, and Jay O'Connor is ultimately arrested by Gardaí. I think it was captured on Inside the K. I don't know if you remember that footage. You can see Jay O'Connor coming out of his house bare-chested. So that case is wended its way through the courts, and he's pled guilty of it. I mean, an incredible life of crime.
Has he been in custody for a period of time?
No, because again, it was a sort of a slow burner. So he's pled guilty to he's pled guilty to the attempted murder of Charlie Cooper, but pled guilty to. He was charged with that initially, but he's pled guilty to the reduced charge of conspiracy to murder. He's also charged with possession of a 9mm firearm and 12 rounds of ammunition with the intent to endanger life. So again, he's also was charged with facilitating a criminal organisation with the commission of 2 serious offences, to wit murder and the sale and supply of drugs. So again, we've seen these cases come before the Special Criminal Court. Yeah. The conspiracy charge, we've discussed this many times. The conspiracy charge seems a lower bar in that, there's a lot of people pleading guilty to these charges. Jay O'Connor, again, who's been on remand for, a good number of months on these charges, pleads guilty to a lesser charge, which obviously the state feel that they're in a position to prove, maybe using some of the facilitation of a gang charge where they can show that this attempted murder was committed on behalf of a criminal organisation. The defendants, as we've seen again and again, obviously feel that they may be in a position to defend, for example, an attempted murder charge if they're not caught directly at the scene or, with their hands on a gun. However, they don't seem to feel confident, do they, in defending themselves as part of a broader conspiracy. And we've seen another one of them plead guilty.
They're going to get kudos for pleading guilty, and they know they're facing mostly something time behind bars, and they're mitigating themselves. They're getting the sentence down by pleading guilty and etc. etc. No doubt he's going to jail.
No doubt he's going to jail, and he's already been in there for a significant period of time on remand.
But, I mean, like, he is living in the same area that this all started, as are most of the characters you're discussing in this. They've all come from the same area. Now, Blanchardstown is huge.
Yeah.
It is, I think, is it a population of 100,000 or something? It is a huge area.
Yeah, huge area.
About a small village.
I mean, it's not just Blanchardstown, it's Corduff, all of that.
All of that area, I think, is fairly hefty population. But at the same time, it's just quite hard to believe that over 3 decades that these guys have all been living cheek by jowl and continuing to fight, and nobody has sort of decided that it's time to lay down the weapons, get on with business. They're a volatile crew.
Yeah, they are
always a volatile, violent crew, and they've remained that way.
Yeah, I mean, Jay O'Connor, wasn't there the famous scene of him being arrested, and he's, rather than, I mean, the old thing of say nothing and you can't be, whatever you say can be used against you in a court of law, as they say, but wasn't there a famous case where he was shouting and roaring, there's going to be war and all of that, as he's been arrested, and there's been so many minor incidents that haven't amounted to it. And Jay O'Connor is going to spend a period of time in jail. We don't know what, but he's already a grandfather. He's already spent a huge amount of time in the prison system, as of his rivals. If you look at the Goulding brothers, I mean, the Daniel Goulding, I think, got an 18-year sentence. David Goulding has also been in and out of prison effectively for large parts of his life. And
the power balance constantly shifts. If somebody's in prison, they're sort of, laid low for a while. They still have those on the outside, obviously, as all the murders happen.
Yeah.
The power balance constantly
it does.
From one
and
side
now,
to the other.
And remember, Jay O'Connor also, while he could never be considered part of the Kinahan organisation, he had deep ties within that structure.
He was said to be personal friends of Daniel Kinahan, whether that was the case or not, but I do recall at that time of the attempted murder on him, and whenever you said it was 2015, the word was that whoever had sort of taken that on was a very brave person, because this was, a friend of his. Now, whether or not that is the case, Daniel Kinahan has few friends, proper friends on the streets, but
yeah, I mean, like Jay O'Connor, of course, would have family ties in the Crumlin area where a lot of the Kinahan cartel main figures were based. He was first cousin of a guy called Garrett Chubb, who would have been very much an associate of
He's gone
Byrne.
Quiet.
He's gone quiet.
We're not trying to
tell
him to not be quiet. I just realised that he was last sort of on the radar when he was in Amsterdam.
Exactly. And that Garrett Chubb, would have been close to Jay O'Connor even as a person. He was also Jay O'Connor, one of his associates was a guy called David Blinky Duffy, who was one of the men jailed for the plot to kill James Mago Gately. So he would have been very much one of Jay O'Connor's associates. So he had a lot of ties in with the Kinahan cartel. Jay O'Connor's associates were also suspected of carrying out the murder of Cain McCormack, who, I think it's judged to be a murder that's considered part of the Kinahan Hutch feud, though again it's
a slightly separate than a feud sort of a situation.
Yeah, a slightly complex murder, but obviously
his father, of course, Noel Kerwin, was murdered directly as part of the feud.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jay O'Connor's associates were certainly the chief suspects for that. And Jay O'Connor was also linked in with another kind of sub-feud of the Kinahan cartel involving James Nellie Walsh as well. And so he's
a fighter.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. I'm exhausted listening to the life that he's led for the last, 30 years pretty much in and out of prison. And it seems such a pointless exercise. It's like you're living every day on war footing, isn't it? You're either, threatening to kill or you're under threat to be killed. Every movement, everything you do during the day surely has to be thought out and considered, and you have to live as if you have a gun pointed at you all the time.
Of course, and, in the meantime, when he comes out, there's a whole new wave of gangland criminals who are operating in that area. And we saw them rise, and obviously some of them would be associated with Jason Hennessy Sr., who lost his life in the now infamous shooting in the steakhouse on Christmas Eve. So they, in Jay O'Connor's absence, there's a whole new wave of come up and started to dominate crime in that area. Jay O'Connor, if you look at him on social media, you can see he's a grandfather, proudly holding his grandkids, and why wouldn't you? You know, he's certainly devoted to his pigeon racing. Do you know? Well, he could be. I'm not. No.
His pigeon.
No, but he loves his pigeons.
Pigeon died in my back garden the other day.
There you go. Well, it wasn't. Yeah.
No, wait, I'll tell you. It crashed into the window.
Oh yeah.
I heard this sort of thing. It was like this really big bang. Now nearly jumped out of my skin. Looked out, and there was this sort of very sort of ronky pigeon. Sort of managed to get himself to a tree, and then he fell and died. And I had to deal with it. Yeah. They of course they get viruses, I think, and can affect them. Oh no, he hit his head.
Yeah.
Killed, it was a kamikaze into my window. I would say he just it's a slight aside, but Jason O'Connor.
Yeah, no, but look,
his pigeon.
Yeah, so that's what he does. I mean, you know, and so he'll no doubt be in the prison system. He will be associated with the killing cartel, but even in the prison system, he'll have.
But it's like, you know, going in and out of prison for these guys. I mean, it's just going to be like taking a bit of a break from it all. You know, you're probably somewhat safer in prison than you are on the outside at times. They fall into the situation. It's part of the job, isn't it? Going to prison. It's just they suck it up.
It is. They do suck it up. But I suppose it must get tougher and tougher.
Wearing, yeah.
Must get wearing.
As you get older.
And as well, you can see with these guys, I don't know if you've ever seen those sheets that they get when they go into prison. And you see people he can't be associated. It's gas when you see it.
Longer and longer and longer.
So there's 25, 30 people, and you'll see he's a cousin of a guy who was shot dead and he can't go near him. So even in prison, their lives become this increasingly restricted kind of...
Living on war footing.
Yeah, living on war footing in there, that they have to be kept, so they can't go to that course because that guy's there, and he can't be moved to that wing because your man's first cousin is there. And yeah, it's... But I mean, if you look back, you know, we talk about these gangland feuds, and they have their peak at a certain point, but you can see how people coming in and out of the jail system, they can spark these things up again, and they just go on and on and on.
Absolutely. And the peak, of course, of that feud we're talking about was probably the years between 2003 and 6.
Yeah, when there was...
Here we are, all these years later, and it's still rumbling. And
funnily enough, when you saw the Crumlin Drimnagh feud, which, you know, I suppose started in something similar time frame, it got taken up then by younger criminals who were barely even born, or some of them weren't even born when that feud began, for no reason other than those lines had been set out. Now, obviously, it's eased over time, but it's the same we have in Limerick there recently. There was an incident at a football match, not that serious, but you had people from those two sides, from the King Colopy side and others from the McCarthy Dundon side, young guys who weren't even born when these shootings were going ahead, and they were still continuing on that sort of bad blood, and it was
sort of tribal.
It's a tribal thing, and it becomes very much a tribal situation where there's estates, you know, in Limerick where people can never go. People, due to the nature of those feuds, the communities get even more, the community of criminals gets even more insular. Certainly at times in Limerick, during that feud, people would never go to the city centre because they'd be afraid of who they'd bump into. So it gets even more and more insular. Now, those things... The world
gets smaller and smaller.
The world gets tiny. And if you drove through Ballinacurra Weston at the height of that feud, in the summer's day like this, there'd be people out in the streets partying, but they could never leave that little stretch of land. Now, you know, it doesn't always stay like that, but Jay O'Connor, those effects are still being felt. And even that bizarre, I mean, that incident with Daniel Goulding was, people could have died. I mean, really could have. Now, he obviously had some sort of paranoid breakdown in the middle of all of that. But all of that was said to have been driven by the fear of, he'd come out of prison and he was being felt encircled and under threat. And, he'll spend the rest of his, he won't be in prison for the rest of his life, but he'll be almost a pensioner when he does get out.
And look, maybe for him, it's worth it. He's a Hugo Boss t-shirt on him. He can afford to wear that. Maybe that's all it's about.
Maybe that's all it is, yeah. That and a couple of pigeons.
That's a couple of pigeons, yeah. All right, Niall, thanks.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.